Klenk Unit 13, Part 3. I just read out the third paragraph of 253, right? Note that despite the occurrence of various operators, the rule of thumb for categorical propositions still holds. The major operator following a universal quantifier is a conditional, and the major operator following the existential quantifier is a conjunction. So that form always remains in place, right? You are very, very likely to have made a mistake in your translation of a categorical if you're using a universal quantifier in your symbolization and the major operator of the propositional function that quantifier binds is anything other than a conditional, right? Universal, always with the conditional, pretty much always, right? As I said, this is a universal with something else, like a dot. That's a legal formula, and there are things that there are occasional things you want to say that will use this form, right? For example, physics statements. But remember what this says. This says, for everything in the universe, both of these predicates are true of it, right? So it's a very, very strong statement. Most of the time, it's the universal with the hook, and the existential with the dot, right? Because the existential says there exists some one x such that, and what you're usually saying is that this is something for which at least two propositional functions hold of it. Okay, so that stays in place. So keep hold of that connection between the universal quantifier and the hook, existential quantifier, and the dot. But the A-E-I-O, the specific A-E-I-O forms, sometimes you need to let them loose a little bit to get a correct symbolization of these hard categoricals. But let's just look at some simple basic ones to see what we're talking about. So just forget about the top one, this stuff. Just look at these two examples here, right? Here's some very, very basic examples where the procedure which Klenk presses, the advice she promotes for symbolizing categoricals with complex subjects and predicates quite clearly holds, all right? And you'll see how following this advice here does get you the right answer. So what are we presented with? We're presented with two statements. We're asked to symbolize them. First one is, students who study will pass. Okay, so notice that this is a categorical sentence, right? It has a subject, both its subject and its predicate are classes, right? So it's not a singular statement, right? The subject is not an individual that is named. The subject is a class, the predicate is a class. So let's identify let's do the three-step procedure. Let's first of all identify the overall form of the categorical, right? It is a categorical. What kind of categorical is it? That is, what relation between the classes is being asserted. I will lay down the form of that categorical, right? And then I will pick out the subject and predicate and then symbolize the subject and predicate. Even here, the three-step procedure is sort of doing 1 and 2 at the same time. That is, identifying the form and picking out the subject and predicate. You sort of need to pick out the subject and predicate, right? The subject class and the predicate class to say what the relation between them are. So you're sort of doing it at the same time. But the point of having one as one, right? Identify the overall form, is that you lay the form down and put the subject and predicate in the right place. So students who study will pass, right? It is asserting a inclusion relation. It is an inclusion relation, not an exclusion relation. Things in the subject class are included, right? Will pass included in the predicate class. And is it universal or particular? It's kind of implicit. You don't have a stated quantifier. It doesn't say all students, or it doesn't say some students, but it's implicit that it's a universal inclusion, right? That I'm saying, when I say students who study will pass, I'm really saying all students who study will pass. Okay, so it's universal inclusion. So so it is an A, universal inclusion. The universal inclusion quantifier categoricals, are the A categoricals, and their form is this. For all x, that's the form, right? Universal quantifier, which binds a propositional function, which is a conditional. My subject's going to go here, my predicate is going to go here. Okay, what do we have? A complex subject, a complex predicate. What's going on here? Well, again, to like we said in Unit 12 and elsewhere, to pick out the subject, to see where the subject ends and the predicate begins, you ask, where's the verb? Where's the verb, right? The subject is the noun plus all the modifiers. So what is the subject class? Well, where is the verb? And then we should have everything preceding the verb, or the major verb, right? Everything preceding it should be the subject, and what follows should be the predicate. We should be then describing the predicate class. So, is my subject students? No, it's students who study, right? What's the subject? Who am I talking about? I'm talking not just about all students, I'm talking in particular about students who study, okay? So that's a complex subject, right? So I might write in English here, students who study, okay? Because it's a complex subject, and it's going to have some structure, right? There's going to be more than one propositional function involved in symbolizing that subject, right? It's not like the categoricals we saw in Unit 12, which, if they had an A form, just had a simple propositional function here and a simple propositional function here. Right? All the categoricals we worked with in Unit 12 and all the examples in Klenk's book were all like, right, the ones we had on the board were AX, SX. Australia is Australian, X is Australian, X is a surfer. Right? All Australians are surfers for all X. If X is Australian, X is a surfer. We've got a bit more complexity here. Our subject is going to require a bit more symbolization, right? And because the verb is will, right? Of these, this is my subject, students who study. What about them? What about them? What am I saying of them? I'm saying that they will pass. I'm predicating of them that they will pass, okay? So that's the verb, right? Will. So what precedes is the subject. Let's call students TX, because we want study. SX, X is X, SX equals X studies. So let's have this, the subject is TX and SX, and PX is X will pass, okay? So see, that's a very simple example of a categorical with a complex subject. Students who study will pass. And you really do need to learn the value of the three-step lesson here, in that you need to recall what I said about symbolizing in sentential logic. Bit by bit, you want to have the first step as the conjunction, such that the form of the conjunction stays in place. Because see how that lesson applies here. What have you got? You've got a for all X, and then you've got two logical connectives. You've got two sentential operators. You've got a dot, and you've got a hook. And what is the point of the three-step procedure? It's to make sure that the hook remains the major operator, okay? It's to make sure that you don't come away with a conjunction, right? It would be a big mistake to have something like this says, right, this. So the main thing to notice about this is that this is a erroneous translation of this sentence, right? The main thing to notice is you've got the universal quantifier with a dot. Ah, you see that? You know you've made a mistake. Pretty sure, right? Because and read it back. This is why you have to read back your symbolization to see if you've made a mistake, right? What does this say? This says, for every single thing in the universe, these two things are true, right? That's already, there's alarms going off. right? Because you've got a universal quantifier. What's over what kind of propositional function? Over a conjunction. For everything in the universe, these two things are true. What two things? Everything in the universe is a student. And also, if that thing studies, then it passes, right? So no, it's not the case. Students who study will pass is a pretty sensible statement. Everything in the universe is a student is not a sensible statement. This piece of chalk is not a student, right? So the point of that is, the reason why we follow the three-step procedure is to get the overall form in place, right? It is universal inclusion. Let's lay down the form of universal inclusion, the A form. It's for all x with the hook. Okay, so that's it. Okay, so look at the one below. Students will pass if they study. Okay, it's also universal inclusion, right? But where's the verb here? The verb is, it's will again, but look here. So my subject here is students, right? So this is universal exclusion, universal inclusion, but now I have a complex predicate, right? But let me again do the most important thing, lay down the right form, right? I want the universal with the hook. I want it a bit more. I want the major operator here to be the hook, right? But now, let me identify and plug in my subject and predicate. Let's keep TX for students, right? For all x, this says, if x is a student, right? Because that's the subject of the sentence. Now here, this is going to be my complex predicate. So, right, this is a simple example of a complex subject. This is a simple example of a complex predicate, right? So, and what do I put here? Oh, yeah, this is an important part of very important part of these symbolizations is learning to rewrite the predicate with the x, right? So, for all x, if x is a student, then what? X will pass if x studies, right? That's how I fill that out, right? For all x, if x is a student, then what? X will pass if x studies. Okay, that's my complex predicate. And now what do? Right, again, think back to symbolization. It's attentional logic. You've got the dot in place, you've got the brackets on either side. Now what are you doing? You're attacking the conjuncts, and you're asking for, first of all, the left conjunct. What's its major operator? Right? So what's the form of that conjunct? What's the major operator? Let me put that form in place. Put the bits in the right part. Same here. Okay, you're just analyzing this. This is not a complete sentence. This is a propositional function, as it should be. It's going to be bound by this quantifier. But x will pass if x studies. So you've got an if, right? So it's going to be what? If x studies, so it follows. The if is the antecedent. If you study, then you'll pass. Hook, brackets, 3x. Okay, so that's the final symbolization of that. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay. But the most important point again is the form, right? You've got the for all x and you've got the hook, right? The overall form of the propositional function bound by the quantifier is a conditional. The subject, that's the subject here, and that's the predicate. The predicate is complex. The predicate is itself a conditional, but see how it's in the right place. This conditional inserts as the consequent of the overall thing, right, of the overall propositional function. So read this back. For all x, for all x, into the major operator. If x is a student, then what? Then if x studies, then x passes. Yes, that's what I said. Students will pass if they study.